Darius King stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of the Southern District Courthouse, 43 stories above Manhattan, watching the city wake beneath a November sky the color of gunmetal. His reflection in the glass showed a man in a navy suit that fit better than anything he'd owned in the past 12 months. The fabric American wool from a mill in Massachusetts that had been clothing men of consequence since before he was born. No tie. The open collar wasn't a fashion choice but a rejection of ornament, a signal that what he carried into that courtroom came from competence, not costume. The clock on the far wall read 9:27, 3 minutes. Across town at the New York Stock Exchange, Vanessa Sterling stood on a balcony overlooking the trading floor in a dress the color of arterial blood, her hand wrapped around a ceremonial gavel that weighed less than the lies she'd built her empire on. Cameras from CNBC and Bloomberg had their lenses trained on her face, waiting to capture the moment a self-made tech CEO became a billionaire. The champagne was already poured. Dom Perignon, $900 a bottle, 12 bottles lined up like soldiers awaiting orders. In 3 minutes, one of them would lose everything. But to understand how we arrived at this moment, at this binary choice between triumph and obliteration, you have to go back 12 months. Back to a different November, a different room, a different version of Darius King. The penthouse at 432 Park Avenue carried that particular kind of silence that only exists in buildings where money has displaced oxygen. November 2023. Late afternoon light slanted through windows that framed Manhattan like a photograph of someone else's life. Darius stood in the living room wearing a faded MIT hoodie he'd bought at a thrift store 6 years earlier, back when pretending to have attended MIT seemed like harmless aspiration rather than the kind of detail that would later underline just how far he'd fallen. Vanessa sat on a sofa that cost more than the car Darius had sold 3 months prior. Italian leather, custom-made, the kind of furniture that existed to communicate status to people who measured worth in objects rather than effort. She hadn't looked up from her phone in 17 minutes. The divorce papers sat on the glass coffee table between them in a blue folder, thick as a Bible, just as full of judgments. Her voice came without warmth, a voice he'd once heard whisper promises in the dark of a Boston basement, back when they'd been building something together instead of dismantling what remained. Stop being dramatic. It's standard separation. My lawyers at Skadden drafted it. Fair. The word landed like a punchline to a joke only she understood. Fair. She was offering him a cabin in Montana he'd never wanted and $150,000 a year. For 3 years. In exchange, he would sign an NDA forbidding him from ever claiming he'd built the technology that powered Payflow, the company currently valued at $18 billion and scheduled to go public in exactly 12 months. The company Darius had coded from nothing while Vanessa handled what she called the real work, which apparently meant convincing rich men to write checks while erasing the name of the person who'd made their investment possible. Darius picked up the blue folder. The pages inside represented 400 hours of billable time from attorneys who charged $900 an hour to translate betrayal into legal language. He flipped to the asset division section, found the paragraph that quantified his contribution to 10 years of marriage and 7 years of building a company, 1 cabin in Montana, market value $200,000, and a monthly stipend that wouldn't cover rent in the city where he'd spent a decade making his wife rich. He took the Mont Blanc pen she'd slid across the table, the same pen he'd given her on their first anniversary, back when anniversary gifts still meant something beyond obligation. Then he did something Vanessa Sterling, Stanford MBA, Forbes 30 under 30 self-proclaimed architect of her own success, did not expect. He drew a single line through the entire asset division section, initialed it, turned to the signature page and signed his name in the space marked Respondent, Darius Elijah King, the middle name from his grandfather, a man who'd worked 30 years at a Detroit steel mill and taught Darius that a man's word meant more than his wallet. A lesson Darius had apparently remembered while Vanessa had been learning different mathematics at business school. Vanessa's smile started to form, premature and predatory, the expression of someone who'd just watched an opponent concede a game she'd rigged from the start. The smile died when Darius removed his wedding ring. Tungsten carbide, not gold. $40 from a Boston pawn shop in 2016, purchased 3 days before he'd proposed in the garage that housed Payflow's first server. Back when neither of them had money, but both of them had something more valuable. He set the ring on top of the blue folder with a sound like a period at the end of a sentence. I don't want the cabin. I don't want the stipend. The room went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with sound. What are you talking about? Darius met her eyes for the first time in the 17 minutes since he'd arrived. They'd been brown once, warm enough to make him believe in partnership. Now they were boardroom glass, reflective surfaces that showed you only what you'd brought with you. I'm walking away with what I brought in. Nothing more, nothing less. Vanessa laughed. The sound came harsh and jagged, like something breaking under pressure it wasn't designed to withstand. You're bluffing. You have no income, no savings. You think playing martyr will make me chase you? I'm not playing. He meant it. She could see he meant it. That was what drained the color from her face, what made her reach for the Scotch glass she'd been nursing since he arrived, the hand trembling just enough to betray the calculation beneath the certainty. If you walk out that door with nothing, don't come crawling back when reality hits. I'll destroy you. Darius walked to the private elevator. Behind him, Vanessa's voice cracked for the first time all night, a hairline fracture in the facade she'd spent 6 years constructing. I gave you everything. I made you somebody. The elevator doors opened. Darius stepped inside. You made me invisible. There's a difference. The doors slid shut on Vanessa standing in $40 million of Manhattan real estate, holding an empty Scotch glass, looking not like a conqueror, but like someone frantically searching for an error in code she hadn't written, couldn't debug, would never understand. The descent took 40 seconds, 40 floors of dropping through the vertical city, watching the numbers decrease, gravity doing what it did best. At the ground floor, Darius walked through a lobby that gleamed with marble and the particular kind of indifference that expensive buildings cultivate toward people who arrive without appointments. On the street, he flagged a cab. The driver glanced at the 2 duffel bags containing everything Darius owned and asked where to. Port Authority, the bus terminal. Greyhound, not Uber. The kind of transportation you took when decisions had to be made with the $347 remaining in your checking account after rent on a storage unit you could no longer afford, and the minimum payment on a credit card whose balance had climbed past dignity into desperation. Maya was waiting at his college roommate's apartment in Queens, the friend who'd taken pity on them after Vanessa's security had escorted father and daughter from the penthouse, while photographers documented the humiliation. His daughter, 11 years old, biracial, brilliant, burdened with a father who'd just chosen principle over pragmatism and couldn't yet explain whether that choice was courage or catastrophe. The cab merged onto the FDR Drive, carrying Darius West toward uncertainty and a daughter who deserved better than a father who measured success in moral victories that wouldn't pay for breakfast. Manhattan disappeared in the rearview mirror. $347. No plan beyond tomorrow. A daughter who'd already lost one mother to selfishness and was about to learn what it cost when the second mother chose ambition over everything else. But Darius King had something Vanessa Sterling didn't understand, had never understood, would spend the next 12 months discovering she should have feared. He had time, and time properly invested paid dividends that couldn't be measured in stock options or penthouse views or the particular kind of emptiness that came from winning everything except the things that mattered. The bus would take 19 hours to reach Los Angeles. Darius had paid for 2 tickets, counting out exact change at the Port Authority counter, while Maya watched with eyes that understood more than he wanted her to. They found seats near the back, away from the bathroom smell and the fluorescent lights that made everyone look sick. Maya pulled a stuffed bear from her backpack. The same bear she'd had since she was 3, back when her biological mother had decided motherhood didn't fit her Instagram aesthetic and left. Vanessa had stepped into that void with surprising grace, reading bedtime stories with funny voices, teaching Maya to question everything, to think critically, to believe that women could build empires. For 3 years, Vanessa had been the mother Maya needed. Then the empire became more important than the girl. "Dad?" Maya's voice was small, tentative, the voice she used when she was afraid of the answer but needed to ask anyway. "Where are we going?" Darius looked out the window at New Jersey industrial sprawl, refineries and warehouses and the accumulated infrastructure of American commerce. He'd been born in Detroit, raised in a house where his mother worked double shifts and his father's definition of wealth was a mortgage paid on time. College hadn't been an option when options were measured in paychecks. He'd learned to code at the public library, teaching himself Python from YouTube tutorials while working days as an auto mechanic, bleeding knuckles in machine learning, grease under his fingernails and algorithms in his head. "Somewhere we can start over." Maya was quiet for 3 exits. Then, "Is it because of Vanessa?" Darius had promised himself he wouldn't poison his daughter against the woman who'd read her Dr. Seuss with perfect voices and taught her that being smart was better than being pretty. But promises made to yourself were easier to break than promises made to others. Grown-ups sometimes make decisions that hurt people they care about. "She doesn't care about us anymore." The certainty in Maya's voice was worse than anger. Anger could be argued with, reasoned away. Certainty came from evidence, from 1,000 small observations that 11-year-old Maya had cataloged and processed and concluded upon with the ruthless logic Vanessa herself had taught her. "She cares about other things more. That doesn't mean she's a bad person. It means she made different choices." Maya looked at him with eyes that had his darkness and her mother's shape, a genetic compromise that reminded him every day of the woman who'd decided they weren't worth staying for. "You always choose us. That's the difference." The words hit like validation and accusation simultaneously. Yes, he chose them. He'd just chosen them over financial security, over the cabin in Montana, over 3 years of stability that would have meant Maya could stay in her school, keep her friends, not have to lie about why her father couldn't afford things other parents bought without thinking. $347. No plan, a daughter who trusted him to have made the right decision. The bus rolled west through the November night, carrying them away from everything they knew toward everything they didn't. But to understand why Darius had walked away from $18 billion, from a settlement any rational person would have taken, from security and comfort and the easy path, you had to go back further. Back to 2013. Back to Boston. Back to a coffee shop near MIT where a black mechanic in oil-stained coveralls met a white MBA student who was crying over a pitch deck that had just been rejected by 12 consecutive investors. The coffee shop was called Voltage. Student dive, bad espresso, worse Wi-Fi. Darius had stopped in after a 12-hour shift at the garage, hands still smelling like transmission fluid despite 3 washes, exhaustion making his bones feel hollow. He was 27. Vanessa was 25. Neither of them knew that the next 4 minutes would determine the trajectory of the next decade. Vanessa sat alone at a corner table, laptop open, face streaked with makeup that had surrendered to tears. The presentation on her screen showed graphs and projections and the kind of optimistic mathematics that venture capitalists saw through immediately. Darius had walked past, intending to grab coffee and leave, but something in her expression stopped him. Not the crying. The anger beneath the crying. The kind of anger that came from being told you weren't good enough by people who measured capability in credentials rather than ideas. He'd pulled up a chair without asking permission. Mobile payment processing? She'd looked up, startled, defensive. "What?" Darius had nodded at her screen. "Your pitch. Mobile payment architecture. The investors said it won't scale, right? How did you—" "Because it won't. Not the way you've designed it. You're trying to centralize transaction validation. That's why they're worried about bottlenecks at volume." Vanessa had stared at him with an expression that cycled through confusion, indignation, and finally curiosity. "And you know this because?" Darius had pulled out his phone, opened a notes app filled with code he'd been writing at 3 a.m. when insomnia and inspiration intersected. He'd been teaching himself distributed systems architecture, fascinated by the problem of scale, by the challenge of making software work for millions when it had been built for dozens. He'd sketched an algorithm on a napkin right there in the coffee shop, showing her how transaction processing could scale if you distributed the validation across nodes instead of funneling everything through a central authority. The napkin diagram was crude, but the logic was elegant, and Vanessa was smart enough to see it. Her eyes had widened. "This could work. It will work. Question is whether you can convince investors you understand why." Vanessa had studied him then, really studied him, seeing past the coveralls and the grease and the lack of a Stanford MBA. "Partner with me." The offer had come fast, instinctive, the kind of decision Vanessa made when she saw opportunity and moved before someone else could claim it. "I build, you sell, 50-50. Darius should have asked for lawyers, contracts, equity agreements in writing, but Vanessa's handshake had been firm and her eyes had been clear, and he'd been 27 and stupid enough to believe that partnership meant something more permanent than convenience. For 3 years it had worked. Darius coded in the basement of Vanessa's apartment while she pitched investors in conference rooms across Cambridge. They'd lived on ramen and ambition, splitting the last dollar for coffee, staying up until 4 a.m. arguing about algorithm efficiency and market positioning. In 2015, they'd closed their Series A. $5 million from a venture firm that saw potential in Vanessa's pitch and the technology Darius had built to back it up. The money had changed things, not immediately, not obviously. But Vanessa had started dressing differently, speaking differently, carrying herself with the particular confidence that comes from having other people's money validate your vision. She'd hired a PR firm, started doing interviews, TechCrunch, Forbes, Bloomberg. The narrative was always the same. Brilliant Stanford MBA disrupts mobile payments, lone female founder in male-dominated industry, self-made success story. Darius's name appeared nowhere. At first, he'd told himself it made sense. Vanessa was the face of the company because she was better at talking to investors, better at selling the vision, better at playing the game that Silicon Valley demanded. His job was to make the technology work. Division of labor. Partners playing to their strengths, but division of labor became division of credit, which became division of worth. In 2016, Darius had proposed to Vanessa in the garage that housed Payflow's first server, the basement space they'd rented for $200 a month from a landlord who'd accepted their pitch about changing the world. He'd bought a tungsten ring from a pawn shop because gold seemed like pretension when they were still eating ramen more nights than not. Vanessa had said yes with tears in her eyes, real tears, the kind that came from emotion rather than calculation. Always partners, always together. She'd meant it. He'd believed her. The wedding was small. City Hall. 2 witnesses they'd pulled from the street. Vanessa's father hadn't attended. He'd told his daughter on the phone, voice loud enough for Darius to hear from across the room, that marrying a mechanic with coding pretensions was proof she'd never amount to anything. That she was settling. That real success meant marrying up, not down. Vanessa had hung up and cried, and Darius had held her and promised that they'd prove her father wrong together. They'd proven him wrong, just not in the way Darius had imagined. By 2017, Payflow had closed a $30 million Series B. The company moved from the basement to real offices in Cambridge, glass and steel, and the kind of space that communicated seriousness to people who measured legitimacy in square footage. They'd hired engineers, customer service, a full operations team. Vanessa had hired a COO to help manage growth. That's when the erasure had begun in earnest. At the company all hands, Vanessa had presented the roadmap for the next 18 months. Growth projections, new features, expansion into European markets. She'd credited the technical team, not Darius, the team. As if the architecture that made Payflow possible had emerged from committee. rather than from one man's sleepless nights and obsessive attention to problems everyone else considered solved. Darius had stood in the back of the room, listening to his wife describe his work without saying his name, and felt something shift inside his chest. Not anger. Anger would have been cleaner. This was more like recognition, the slow dawning awareness that the partnership he'd believed in was being retroactively redefined as employment, and employment without the dignity of a paycheck or a title or any acknowledgement that his contribution had been more than following orders. After the meeting, he'd confronted Vanessa in her office. "Why didn't you mention me?" She'd looked up from her laptop, distracted, already thinking about the next meeting, the next investor call, the next rung on a ladder Darius wasn't climbing with her anymore. "I credited the technical team. I built the core architecture. Me, not the team." Vanessa had sighed, the particular sigh that communicated patience wearing thin. Investors don't care about individual contributors. They care about the company. You understand that, right? I understand you just told 200 people that what I built came from a team I'm not even managing. You're being sensitive. The accusation had landed like a diagnosis. Sensitive, emotional, unable to separate ego from business. The subtext was clear. Darius was making a problem out of something that wasn't a problem unless you cared more about recognition than results. He'd let it go. That was the first mistake in a chain of mistakes that had led to this moment, to this bus rolling through the American night carrying a man with $347 and a daughter who deserved better. The pattern had repeated. In 2018, at a TechCrunch gala where tickets cost $5,000 and Darius had worn a suit from Goodwill that didn't quite fit, an investor had asked him what he did. Vanessa had been standing right there, champagne in hand, smile perfect. She'd answered before Darius could. "Darius handles the basement work." The technical side." The investor had nodded, already losing interest, already moving his attention back to Vanessa, the founder, the visionary, the person worth knowing. Basement work, as if 7 years of architecture and algorithms and solving problems that would have killed the company 3 times over could be reduced to a location and a dismissal. Darius had excused himself, found the bathroom, stood at the sink looking at his reflection in a mirror surrounded by the kind of lighting that made everyone look either important or sick, depending on which side of success you occupied. His suit was too big in the shoulders. The tie was wrong, some pattern that had been fashionable 5 years earlier. He looked like someone pretending to belong in a room full of people who'd been born belonging. But it wasn't the suit that bothered him. It was the realization that Vanessa had introduced him with embarrassment, that she'd positioned him as support staff rather than partner, that somewhere in the journey from basement to boardroom, he'd been reclassified from essential to auxiliary. Maya had been 8 then, still young enough to believe Vanessa was her mother, to call her mom without hesitation, to trust that the woman who read her stories and helped with homework and taught her that smart girls could do anything would always be there. Vanessa had been good to Maya. Darius couldn't deny that. Whatever was happening between them didn't extend to his daughter. Vanessa still made time for bedtime stories, still showed up for school events, still treated Maya with the kind of attention and care that made Darius believe that maybe the distance growing between husband and wife was just the inevitable evolution of a relationship under the pressure of building something big. People changed. Relationships evolved. That didn't mean they stopped being partners. Then in 2020, Vanessa had hired Brandon Cross. Brandon Cross had arrived at Payflow with a Harvard MBA. Connections to 3 venture firms that mattered, and the kind of polished confidence that came from never having worked a day when failure meant missing rent. 40 years old, 6'2", suits that cost more than Darius made in a month back when Darius had made anything at all. Vanessa had introduced him at an all-hands as chief operating officer, the person who would help scale Payflow from promising startup to industry leader. Darius had shaken his hand. Brandon's grip had been firm, his smile professional, his eyes already moving past Darius to someone more important. The affair had started within 6 months. Darius couldn't prove it then, wouldn't discover the text messages until much later. But he'd felt the shift. Vanessa started coming home later, 11 p.m., becoming midnight, becoming 1 a.m. She'd sit at the kitchen counter with her laptop open, typing emails, attending to the endless demands of a company preparing for its public debut. When Darius tried to talk, she'd hold up a finger. 1 minute. Give me 1 minute. 1 minute became 10. 10 became 20. 20 became Vanessa closing the laptop and going to bed without a word, exhausted by work that apparently didn't include room for conversation with the man who'd built the foundation everything else rested on. Brandon was always there in the background, late-night strategy sessions, weekend meetings that couldn't wait, board preparations that required hours of Vanessa's time behind closed doors. Darius had wanted to believe it was professional, that the intimacy of building something big naturally created connections that looked like more than they were. Then he'd seen them together at a company retreat in Napa. October 2020. Payflow had rented a resort for 3 days. Team building and strategic planning and the kind of manufactured bonding that companies did when they had money to spend on pretending work was family. Darius had gone because Vanessa had asked him to, because leaving Maya with a sitter for 3 days felt wrong, because he'd still believed that showing up mattered. The resort had a pool. Darius had been walking back from dropping Maya at the kids' program when he'd seen Vanessa and Brandon on the terrace, drinks in hand, standing closer than colleagues stood. Brandon had whispered something. Vanessa had laughed, the real laugh, the one Darius hadn't heard in months. Her hand had touched Brandon's arm, lingered there. A gesture that communicated familiarity beyond professional. Darius had stood there, frozen, watching his wife flirt with another man while their daughter played with other kids whose parents worked for the company Darius had built. And Vanessa was busy giving away to someone else. He'd confronted her that night in their hotel room. How long? Vanessa had been removing makeup, using some cream that cost $60 an ounce. Taking her time with the ritual. How long what? You and Brandon. How long has it been going on? She'd met his eyes in the mirror, and for a second he'd thought she might deny it, might lie, might give him the dignity of pretending he was wrong. Instead, she'd turned around and looked at him with an expression that held no guilt, only calculation. Does it matter? The question had been worse than confession. Does it matter that you're sleeping with your COO? Yeah, Vanessa, it matters. We're not sleeping together, we're working together. If that creates chemistry, that's a byproduct of building something important. Chemistry. Brandon understands what we're trying to accomplish. He gets the vision in a way you stopped getting years ago. The accusation had landed like a rewrite of history. Darius had stopped getting the vision. Darius had become the obstacle rather than the architect. Darius was the problem in an equation that worked perfectly well without him. I built the vision. I built the technology that makes the vision possible. Vanessa had turned back to the mirror, resumed removing makeup. You built version 1. We've evolved past what you're capable of maintaining. The words had sat in the hotel room like a third person, heavy and undeniable. Darius had slept on the couch that night. In the morning, he'd packed Maya's things and driven them both back to Boston 3 hours early, leaving Vanessa at the resort with Brandon and the rest of the team that was building something Darius apparently couldn't understand anymore. Maya had been quiet on the drive home, looking out the window at California wine country passing by. Are you and Mom getting divorced? The question had come so matter-of-fact that Darius had almost missed it. What makes you think that? You're sleeping in different rooms, you don't talk anymore, and that man Brandon looks at her the way you used to. 9 years old, too observant, too smart, too burdened with awareness that childhood should have protected her from. Darius had wanted to lie, to offer reassurance, to tell Maya that adults sometimes went through rough patches but everything would be fine. Instead, he'd given her the truth. I don't know what's going to happen, but whatever happens, you're going to be okay. We're going to be okay. Maya had nodded, still looking out the window. Can we stop for ice cream? They'd stopped, Dairy Queen off Highway 101. Maya had gotten a blizzard with too many toppings, and Darius had sat across from her in a plastic booth watching his daughter pretend everything was normal while her world quietly dissolved. The erosion had continued through 2021, systematic and irreversible. In January, Vanessa had asked Darius for $35,000, bridge loan for Series C preparation. The lawyers needed retainers, the accountants needed advance payment. The machinery of taking a company public required capital that venture funding didn't quite cover. Darius had withdrawn the money from his retirement account, the 401k he'd been building since he was 23, back when he'd thought compound interest and consistent contributions would eventually mean security. Vanessa had taken the check without comment, without gratitude, as if Darius's contribution was obligation rather than sacrifice. No paperwork, no equity adjustment, no acknowledgement that this was a loan rather than a gift. In May, she'd asked for $55,000 more. IPO filing fees, regulatory compliance, the costs of going public that somehow weren't covered by the $30 million in Series B funding, or the partnerships Brandon had been negotiating, or the revenue that Payflow was supposedly generating. Darius had sold his car. The Honda he'd bought used in 2015 maintained himself, driven until it had 200,000 miles and a rusted undercarriage but still ran. He'd gotten $8,000 for it. The remaining $47,000 had come from a home equity line of credit against the condo he'd bought before the marriage, the one asset that was his alone until he'd leveraged it for Vanessa's company. She'd deposited the check without questions, running total $90,000. Maya needed new shoes. Her feet were growing faster than their budget could accommodate. Darius had taken her to Payless, the discount store where shoes cost $19 instead of $90, where the quality meant they'd need replacing in 6 months, but 6 months was a planning horizon Darius could manage. Maya hadn't complained. That was worse than if she had. In August, Vanessa had come to Darius with the biggest ask yet. They'd been in the kitchen of the penthouse, the apartment Vanessa had insisted they rent when the Series B closed, $40,000 a month for views of Central Park and the kind of address that communicated arrival. Darius had argued against it. They could have stayed in Boston, saved the money, invested in the company or their future or literally anything other than status. But Vanessa had insisted that appearances mattered, that investors needed to see success, that you had to spend money to make money. She'd been standing at the counter, coffee in hand, dressed for a board meeting that was starting in 2 hours. I need $120,000. No preamble, no context, just the number, stated with the assumption that Darius would provide it. For what? Final round before IPO. We're short on operating capital. The bridge money will guarantee we don't have to do a down round. Down round meant raising money at a lower valuation than the previous round, a signal that the company was struggling, a red flag that could kill momentum before the public offering. Darius understood the logic. He also understood that $120,000 was more money than he had liquid access to without doing something that would hurt for years. I'd have to mortgage the condo. Then mortgage it. This is the last ask. Once we go public, you'll get 10 times this back. The promise had been delivered with certainty, with the confidence of someone who'd spent 6 years watching graphs go up and right and had internalized that trajectory as inevitable rather than contingent. Darius had mortgaged the condo, the one asset he'd brought into the marriage, the 1,200 square foot space in Somerville he'd bought with a VIA loan his uncle had helped him qualify for. The bank had given him $130,000 against equity he'd built over 8 years of payments. He'd handed Vanessa $120,000 and kept $10,000 for the closing costs and the sick feeling in his stomach that he'd just made a mistake he couldn't undo. Total invested in Vanessa's company, $210,000. Total equity received, 0. Total acknowledgement of contribution, also 0. Maya's school had a fall fundraiser. Parents were asked to donate what they could to support the arts program. Suggested contribution, $500. Darius had written a check for $50 and felt the teacher's eyes linger on the amount. before she'd smiled and thanked him with the particular kind of politeness reserved for people who couldn't afford to participate at the expected level. Maya had come home that afternoon and asked if they were poor. The question had arrived without warning, the way children's questions did, direct and unburdened by the social machinery adults used to avoid uncomfortable truths. Darius had been making dinner, spaghetti and sauce from a jar, the kind of meal that cost $6 and fed them both with enough left over for lunch the next day. "What makes you ask that?" "Emma's mom said her family is donating $5,000 to the school. She asked how much we were donating and I didn't know." $5,000. The casual wealth of parents who worked in finance or tech or inherited money and thought $5,000 was a normal amount to spend on a fundraiser for elementary school art supplies. "We're not poor, but we have to be careful with money right now." Maya had nodded, absorbing this, processing it with the ruthless logic she'd inherited from both parents. "Is it because of Mom's company?" The question had precision that shouldn't have surprised him. Maya was 10, old enough to understand that money came from somewhere and went somewhere else, old enough to notice that Vanessa bought $300 shoes while Darius shopped at discount stores, old enough to wonder why the patterns didn't match. Mom's building something important. Sometimes that means sacrifices. You're the one sacrificing. The observation had come without judgment, just statement of fact, but it had hit Darius like an indictment he couldn't argue against. October 2021 had brought new humiliations public this time. Payflow held a company all-hands at a hotel in Manhattan, 200 employees gathering to hear about progress toward the IPO, timelines and milestones, and the manufactured enthusiasm that startups use to keep people believing they were part of something historic. Vanessa had presented for 40 minutes, slides about growth and market penetration and the technological innovation that made Payflow different from every other payment processor. The technological innovation Darius had built. She'd shown a slide with the core algorithm, the distributed validation system that allowed Payflow to process millions of transactions without bottlenecks. The same algorithm Darius had sketched on a napkin in a Boston coffee shop in 2013, had spent 3 years refining, had patented with Vanessa's name as sole inventor. An engineer in the audience, someone new who didn't know the history, had raised his hand. "Who designed the validation protocol? That architecture is genius." Vanessa had smiled, comfortable in her expertise, ready to claim credit. "It was a collaborative team effort. We had some brilliant engineers in the early days who really understood distributed systems." Some brilliant engineers, not Darius, not the person who designed every line of the protocol, not the architect whose vision had made the collaboration possible. Some brilliant engineers. Darius had been standing in the back of the room, having taken a personal day from his job at a consulting firm where he now worked because Payflow had never actually employed him, had never offered him salary or equity or any formal recognition that his contribution was more than volunteer work. He'd watched his wife credit unnamed brilliant engineers for work he'd done while their daughter sat in aftercare because neither parent could pick her up at 3. After the meeting, Darius had approached Vanessa in the hallway outside the conference room. "Why didn't you mention me?" She'd been checking her phone, responding to a text from Brandon probably, attention already moving to the next thing. "I credited the technical team. I built that algorithm. Me, alone, in your basement while you were in meetings." Vanessa had looked up from her phone with an expression that communicated annoyance at being interrupted by minutia. "Darius, we've talked about this. The narrative is about Payflow, not individual contributors. Investors don't care who wrote specific code." "I'm not asking you to tell investors. I'm asking you to acknowledge what I did to 200 people who work at a company I built. You helped build. There's a difference." The correction had been delivered with the casual cruelty of someone who'd rewritten history so many times they'd started believing their own revision. Darius had walked out of the hotel, Taken the subway to Queens, picked Maya up from aftercare 2 hours late because the train had delays, and he'd spent 40 minutes standing on the platform trying to decide whether the anger in his chest was justified or just ego bruised by reality he should have accepted years ago. Maya had been waiting with one other kid, a boy whose parents also worked jobs that didn't end at 3. She'd looked up when Darius arrived, relief and something else crossing her face, not anger. Resignation, the look of a child who'd learned that adults made promises they couldn't always keep. "Sorry I'm late." "It's okay." They'd walked to the subway together. Maya had talked about her day, a project on photosynthesis, a test she'd aced. Normal kid things that should have filled Darius with pride, but instead reminded him that his daughter was brilliant in ways that deserved better than a father who couldn't afford to pick her up on time. On the train, Maya had fallen asleep against his shoulder, homework half done in her lap, trusting that Darius would get them home safe even when everything else was falling apart. November 2021 had broken something that couldn't be repaired. Darius's mother had called on a Tuesday. Lung cancer, stage 3. The doctors had found it late, too late for the easy interventions, early enough that treatment might buy time measured in years instead of months. The treatment would cost $45,000 after insurance, a number that existed in the abstract for people with savings but landed like a prison sentence. For people who'd already mortgaged everything they owned. Darius had gone to Vanessa that night. She'd been in the home office, door closed, on a video call with the board. Darius had waited in the hallway for 20 minutes, listening to her voice through the door, discussing valuation models and investor sentiment and the timing of the IPO filing. When she'd finally emerged, it was past 11. "Can we talk?" Vanessa had glanced at her watch, an Apple Watch that cost more than the monthly mortgage Darius was paying on the condo he'd leveraged for her company. "Can it wait? I have a call with London at 6 a.m. My mother has cancer." That had stopped her. For a second, genuine concern had crossed her face, the shadow of the person who'd cried at their City Hall wedding, who'd promised they'd prove her father wrong together. "Oh God, I'm sorry. Is she okay?" "She needs treatment. $45,000 after insurance." Vanessa had nodded, processing, and Darius had felt something like hope that she'd understand, that she'd remember the $210,000 he'd given her, that she'd offer to help without being asked. "That's terrible timing." Timing, as if his mother's cancer had consulted a calendar before metastasizing. "I need to help her. I was hoping we could delay the mortgage payment for a couple months, just until I can." "Delay the mortgage? Darius, that affects my credit too. We're married." The "we're married" had landed like irony she didn't intend. "I've given you $200,000 over the last year. I'm asking for time to help my mother." Vanessa's expression had shifted then, from concern to something harder. "You didn't give me $200,000. You invested in opportunities I created. There's a difference." "I invested? I have zero equity, zero ownership. I got nothing." "You got the opportunity to be part of something bigger than yourself. Not everything is about immediate return." Darius had felt the anger rise in his chest, hot and righteous and utterly useless. "My mother is dying. I understand that, but I can't bail you out every time you have a financial problem. Maybe if you'd focused on building your own career instead of—" She'd stopped herself, but the sentence didn't need completion. Instead of what? Instead of spending 7 years building her company? Instead of coding in basements while she pitched investors? Instead of sacrificing everything for a partnership she'd redefined as charity the moment it became inconvenient? Instead of what, Vanessa? "I didn't mean it like that." "How did you mean it?" She'd been quiet for a long moment, and in that silence Darius had understood something he'd been avoiding for months. This wasn't a rough patch. This wasn't stress from preparing for an IPO. This was who Vanessa had become, who maybe she'd always been, beneath the borrowed empathy and the promises made when keeping them cost nothing. "I can't give you money right now. The IPO filing is in 3 months. Every dollar matters." "I'm not asking for money, I'm asking for time." "Same thing." The equation had been laid bare. Time was money. Money was ownership. Ownership was power, and Darius had none of the variables that mattered. He'd walked out of the office, gone to the bathroom, stood at the sink looking at his reflection. 38 years old, $210,000 in debt, mother dying, daughter sleeping, wife measuring his worth in quarterly returns. The next morning, Darius had found the text messages. He hadn't been snooping. Vanessa had left her iPad on the kitchen counter, unlocked, open to messages. Darius had picked it up to move it, had seen Brandon's name at the top of the thread, had told himself not to read it. He'd read it anyway. The messages went back 18 months, hundreds of them. Some about work, board strategies, and investor management and the legitimate business of running a company. But threaded through the professional were messages that had nothing to do with operations. Brandon, when are you leaving the dead weight? Vanessa, after IPO. Need him to finish the security updates first, then clean break the dead weight. That was Darius, the thing to be removed once it had served its purpose. He'd scrolled further back, stomach turning. Vanessa, sometimes I think marrying him was the biggest mistake I ever made. Brandon, you were young. You didn't know what you were building yet. Vanessa, he's brilliant with code, useless with everything else. Brandon, 6 more months, then you're free. The messages were dated October 2021, 3 weeks ago. While Darius had been asking for time to help his dying mother, Vanessa had been planning his extraction with the precision she'd used to plan every other aspect of her company. Darius had set the iPad down, made coffee, woken Maya for school, packed her lunch with hands that felt like they belonged to someone else. Watched his daughter eat cereal and talk about a field trip to the Natural History Museum. Normal kid morning, while the text messages sat in his pocket like a grenade with the pin already pulled. He told himself he'd confront her, demand explanation, ask why she'd bothered staying married to someone she was already planning to divorce. But he hadn't, because somewhere in the previous 18 months, in the erosion of partnership into exploitation, in the redefinition of collaboration as charity, Darius had stopped being surprised by Vanessa's capacity for cruelty. The text messages were just documentation of what he'd already known. She'd measured his worth and found it wanting. The only question was what he'd do with that information. The bus reached Los Angeles after 19 hours of highways and rest stops and the particular exhaustion that came from sitting still while your life moved in directions you couldn't control. Maya slept most of the way, head against the window, trusting that Darius had a plan beyond putting distance between them and the life they'd left. Darius didn't have a plan. He had $347. He had a daughter who'd already lost too much. He had the certainty that staying in New York meant watching Vanessa complete her erasure of him, while he paid rent with money he didn't have for an apartment she'd chosen. Los Angeles at least offered the dignity of failure in warm weather. They'd stayed with Darius's college roommate for 3 weeks, sleeping on a couch in Van Nuys, Maya doing homework on the floor while Darius sent resumes to tech companies that never responded. Then the roommate's girlfriend had moved in and the couch stopped being available, and Darius had found the trailer park in Riverside, Winnebago, 1987, 12 feet long, $450 a month for the lot, utilities extra, no air conditioning, no insulation, metal box that became an oven when the California sun hit it, icebox when desert nights dropped below 40. But it was theirs, no landlord to answer to, no Vanessa measuring their worth in rent checks. Just Darius and Maya and the space between what they'd had and what they'd become. Darius had found work at Amazon. Warehouse, night shift, $18 an hour, picking orders and loading trucks while machines timed his every movement and managers tracked his productivity against algorithms designed to extract maximum efficiency from human bodies. He'd worked as a mechanic for 12 years. He'd taught himself to code. He'd built technology that processed millions of transactions. Now he was picking iPhone cases and dog food off shelves, racing against a timer, saving minutes that added up to nothing. Maya enrolled in middle school, Riverside Unified. The kind of school where half the kids qualified for free lunch and the other half pretended they didn't. She'd gone from a private academy in Manhattan where tuition cost $30,000 a year to a public school where the library had books from 1987 and the computer lab ran Windows 7. She'd never complained. That was the worst part. Maya had absorbed the change with the resilience of children who'd learned that complaining changed nothing, that adults made decisions and kids lived with consequences. But Darius had seen it in small ways. The pause before she answered when classmates asked what her dad did, the careful navigation of questions about why they'd moved, the lies she told without lying, omissions that painted a picture of a life that didn't include trailer parks and discount shoes and the particular shame of poverty in a country that measured worth in net worth. One afternoon in March, Darius had picked Maya up from school early for a dentist appointment. They'd been walking to the bus stop when Maya had asked if she could stay after school the next day. What for? Science club. They're building robots. Darius had felt something crack in his chest. Maya loved science, loved building things, had Vanessa's brain for systems and Darius's patience for details. She should have been in science club. She should have been building robots. She should have had all the opportunities that money could buy. Of course you can. Maya had smiled, the real smile, the one that reminded Darius why every sacrifice was worth it. Then, Emma asked why I don't have an iPad. I told her you're saving up to buy the Pro model. The lie had been delivered matter-of-factly without shame. Just a child navigating social terrain where not having an iPad marked you as different, as less. As someone whose family couldn't afford the $800 entry fee to normal. Darius had wanted to rage against a system where his daughter had to lie to protect his dignity. He'd wanted to call Vanessa and tell her that their daughter was pretending poverty was planning while Vanessa lived in a penthouse, and prepared to become a billionaire on an IPO built on technology Darius had created. Instead, he'd hugged Maya and told her they'd get an iPad soon, a promise he had no way to keep. Another lie stacking on top of the lies they were both telling to make poverty feel like something other than failure. May 2024. 6 months into the trailer park, Darius had been working at Amazon for 7 months, his body adapting to night shifts the way bodies adapted to punishment when the alternative was homelessness. He'd applied for 67 software engineering positions. Apple, Google, Microsoft, smaller companies, startups, anyone who might look past the 7-year gap in his resume. Every application had been rejected. Some didn't even send rejection emails. Just silence, the algorithmic screening that filtered him out before human eyes saw his qualifications. Others sent templated responses. Thank you for your interest, but we've decided to pursue candidates whose experience more closely aligns with our current needs. The 7-year gap was the problem. From 2013 to 2020, Darius's resume showed homemaker, a euphemism for unemployed. A red flag that screamed to HR algorithms that this person had been out of the industry too long to be valuable. He tried explaining in cover letters, built Payflow's core architecture, created distributed validation system, held patents on transaction processing algorithms that were currently valued at $18 billion. But the patents listed Vanessa Sterling as sole inventor. Darius's name appeared nowhere in the public record. He couldn't prove he'd built what he claimed to have built because Vanessa had systematically erased him from the documentation. By July, Darius had stopped applying. The rejection wasn't even personal anymore. It was just mathematics. The algorithm had decided he was unemployable, and the algorithm didn't care about nuance or truth, or the gap between what resume said and what reality had been. August 2024. 9 months after signing the divorce papers. Darius's bank account held $287. The trailer park rent was due in 3 days. Amazon had cut his hours because warehouse volume was down. Maya needed school supplies for 6th grade. The list had 20 items. Darius had bought 12. Then the storage unit had sent the final notice. Darius had been paying $85 a month for a 10 by 10 space that held boxes from the marriage, furniture, and Christmas decorations and the accumulated debris of a life that had looked successful from the outside. He'd kept paying because selling everything felt like admitting defeat, like acknowledging that the life he'd built with Vanessa was gone beyond recovery. But the last payment had bounced. The storage company had sent 3 notices. The final one was clear. Clear out the unit by Friday or we auction the contents to cover your debt. Darius had borrowed a truck from a coworker, the kind of favor that came with the understanding you'd return it fast and full of gas. Maya had come with him. School just ended for the day, backpack still on, ready to help her father salvage what remained of their previous life. The storage unit was in Riverside, 15 minutes from the trailer park, climate-controlled space that had cost more per month than Darius now paid for housing. They'd opened the metal door and looked at boxes that might as well have belonged to strangers. Christmas ornaments Vanessa had insisted on buying at Crate and Barrel. Books neither of them had read. The Italian sofa that had cost $40,000 and would sell for maybe $4 at auction. Maya had moved through the boxes while Darius tried to calculate what was worth keeping versus what would fit in the truck versus what mattered when you were choosing between possessions and rent. Then Maya had called from the back corner. "Dad, what's this?" She'd been holding an external hard drive, the kind that had been cutting edge in 2016 but now looked like archaeological evidence. Someone had labeled it in faded Sharpie, Payflow Alpha Build 2016, Do Not Delete. Darius's hands had started shaking before his brain caught up with what he was seeing. The backup drive. The insurance policy he'd created 3 years into the marriage when Vanessa had gone through a paranoid security phase after a competitor tried to poach their engineers. She'd demanded Darius wipe all company files from personal devices. He'd complied publicly. Privately, he'd created a backup and hidden it in a box of winter clothes, reasoning that insurance against disaster was prudent even when disaster seemed unlikely. He'd forgotten about it. Through the escalation and the exploitation and the betrayal and the divorce, through 9 months of poverty and rejection and watching his daughter learn to lie about iPads, Darius had forgotten he had proof. That's old work stuff from a long time ago. Maya had handed him the drive and moved to the next box. Darius had stood in the storage unit holding plastic and circuitry that weighed maybe 8 ounces but suddenly felt heavy as vindication. That night, after Maya had fallen asleep in the trailer's narrow bunk, Darius had plugged the hard drive into his laptop. The machine had spun up with sounds that suggested age and fragility. Files had appeared on the screen, hundreds of them, organized in folders that Darius had labeled with systematic precision back when he'd still believed organization mattered. Source code, design documents, email chains, technical specifications, the complete architecture of Payflow's transaction processing system, frozen in time from 2016. Darius had opened the core algorithm file. The code had scrolled past, familiar as his own handwriting because it was his handwriting. His logic translated into Python, his architecture solving problems Vanessa hadn't even known existed. Comments throughout, #DK, Darius King, optimize for distributed load balancing, check redundancy and key rotation, stress test under high volume conditions, his initials, his notes, his architecture. Then he'd found the patent filing, saved as PDF in a subfolder labeled Legal. October 2016, predictive transaction algorithm with dynamic encryption. Inventor, Vanessa Sterling, status approved. Darius's name appeared nowhere, not as co-inventor, not as contributor, nowhere. Vanessa had taken his architecture, filed patents in her name, built an $18 billion company on technology she'd claimed as hers alone. She hadn't just betrayed him. She'd stolen his intellectual property with the kind of systematic precision that suggested planning rather than impulse. Darius had kept searching through the files, found email chains from 2016 where Vanessa had asked him to explain the encryption protocol so she could present it to investors. Found his responses, detailed technical explanations that she'd apparently copied into pitch decks word for word. Found her promises to make him co-founder, to add him to the cap table, to ensure that when Payflow went public they'd share the success as partners. None of those promises had been kept. Then Darius had found something that made his blood run cold. A folder labeled Payflow Current, dated 2 weeks earlier. Someone had sent it to Darius's old personal email, probably a misdirected attachment from an engineer who'd gotten the wrong address. Inside was the current production codebase, version 3.4, the software running Payflow's platform as it prepared for its public debut. Darius had opened the transaction validation module, started reading, felt his stomach drop. The offshore contractors Vanessa had hired to update the system had deleted the volume throttle code. The safety mechanism Darius had built to prevent cascade failures under high transaction load was gone, removed by developers who'd apparently thought it was inefficient overhead rather than essential architecture. Without the throttle, when transaction volume exceeded a certain threshold, the system would try to regenerate encryption keys faster than it could validate them. The validation queue would overflow, the firewall would drop, user data would be exposed. Darius ran the numbers in his head. Payflow processed approximately 10,000 transactions per hour during normal operation. On IPO day, when trading opened and investors rushed to buy stock, when every financial blogger and retail trader hit the platform simultaneously, transaction volume would spike to 100,000 per hour minimum. The system would crash in 4 minutes. 8.3 million user records would be exposed. Bank accounts, social security numbers, transaction histories. The biggest data breach in fintech history. And Vanessa had no idea it was coming. Darius had sat in the trailer at 2 in the morning, laptop screen illuminating the metal walls, holding proof that his wife had committed fraud and evidence that her company was about to implode on the most public stage imaginable. He could warn her. Call, send an email, reach out through a lawyer and explain that the code was broken, that IPO day would be a disaster unless she fixed the flaw immediately. Or he could do nothing. Let the crash happen. Let Vanessa learn on live television that the empire she'd built on stolen foundation was structurally unsound. Darius had closed the laptop, looked at Maya sleeping 6 feet away, peaceful and trusting that her father would make the right choice. The right choice wasn't revenge, but it also wasn't rescue. Somewhere between those two options was justice, and justice required resources Darius didn't have. Lawyers, accountants, technical experts who could validate what he'd found. Money to file lawsuits and survive the counterattack that Vanessa's billion-dollar legal team would launch. He'd saved a number in his phone 8 years earlier. A number he'd never called, had never needed to call, had kept as insurance against a future that had seemed impossible until it wasn't. Darius had stared at that number for 20 minutes. Then he'd made the call. 3 days after Darius made the call, a man arrived at the trailer park driving a black Cadillac Escalade that looked like it had been detailed that morning. The vehicle was worth more than everything Darius owned, including the trailer, the laptop, and whatever equity remained in the condo he'd mortgaged for Vanessa's company. The man who stepped out wore a charcoal suit despite the August heat, his posture suggesting either military service or the kind of discipline that amounted to the same thing. He'd knocked on the trailer door at 7 in the morning, early enough that Maya was still asleep but late enough that Darius had been awake for 2 hours, unable to sleep past 5 after 9 months of night shifts had rewired his circadian rhythm into something nocturnal. Darius King? The voice carried flat Midwest vowels and the particular calm that came from men who'd seen violence and survived it. Who's asking? Thomas Webb. I represent Harrison Steele. The name triggered a memory Darius had buried under a decade of other concerns. Detroit, 2014. Darius had been working union electrical at a defense manufacturing plant. Good pay while he figured out his next move after a startup had folded and taken his savings with it. There'd been an explosion in the main assembly building. Gas leak, someone had said later, though the investigation had suggested negligence rather than accident. Darius had been walking past when the blast hit. Most people had run away. Darius had run toward it, toward the sound of someone screaming under rubble, toward smoke and the chemical smell of things burning that shouldn't burn. He'd found a man pinned beneath a collapsed steel gantry, conscious but fading, blood pooling from a laceration that needed pressure immediately. Darius had pulled the debris away, administered CPR when the man's heart had stopped, kept pressure on the wound until paramedics arrived 12 minutes later. The man had survived. Darius had left before anyone could ask his name, before paperwork and incident reports could complicate what had been simple instinct to help someone who needed it. "I don't know Harrison Steele." Thomas Webb had smiled without warmth. "He knows you. The man you pulled from that factory fire in Detroit was Harrison Steele, CEO of Steele Defense Industries, Medal of Honor recipient, Gulf War 1991. He's been looking for you for 10 years. The information had arrived too fast to process. Darius had helped someone, sure, but people helped people in emergencies. You didn't track down Good Samaritans a decade later unless there was something else happening beneath the surface. Why now? Harrison saw your divorce filing. Then he saw who you married. Then he had his team investigate Payflow's financials. Webb had paused, measuring his words. When Harrison learns someone has been wronged, especially someone who saved his life, he takes an interest. And when that wrong involves intellectual property theft, his interest becomes personal. The explanation had sounded rehearsed, but rehearsal didn't make it false. "I don't understand." Harrison's brother, Nathan Steele, was a software engineer. 26 years ago, a business partner stole Nathan's code, patented it under his own name, built a company worth $200 million. Nathan sued, couldn't afford good lawyers, lost everything. Killed himself in 1999, 3 months after the verdict. The story had landed like a mirror held up to Darius's future if he let Vanessa's theft stand unchallenged. Harrison swore on Nathan's grave that if he ever found another case of IP theft, he'd burn the thief to the ground, not for money, for his brother. And now he's found you. Webb had gestured toward the Escalade idling at the curb, air conditioning running, windows tinted dark enough to hide secrets. "He'd like to meet you. He has resources you'll need, lawyers, investigators, technical experts. A safe place for you and your daughter while we build the case. Harrison doesn't do things halfway." Darius had looked back at the trailer where Maya slept, 11 years old, too smart for her own good, learning to navigate a world that measured worth in money they didn't have. He'd spent 9 months telling himself that walking away from Vanessa's offer had been the right choice. That dignity mattered more than dollars, that someday Maya would understand why her father had chosen principle over pragmatism. But dignity didn't pay rent. Principle didn't buy school supplies. And understanding wouldn't help Maya when she was 16 and applying to colleges she couldn't afford. Because her father had been too proud to take a settlement that would have at least provided stability. What does Harrison want in return? To watch Vanessa Sterling learn that stealing from people has consequences. To honor his brother by making sure you don't end up like Nathan. To prove that justice still exists for people who can't afford to buy it. The answer should have sounded too good to be true, but Webb's delivery suggested he'd given this speech before, that Harrison Steele had made a habit of finding wrongs and righting them with the resources that came from building weapons systems for the Department of Defense. "There's a jet waiting at Ontario Airport. Flight plan filed for Bozeman, Montana. We can be airborne in 90 minutes. Your daughter is welcome. Harrison's granddaughter is 13, lost her father in Iraq. The girls might understand each other." Darius had thought about the 67 job rejections, the $287 in his bank account, the storage unit he'd just lost, the hard drive containing proof that Vanessa had committed fraud. But no way to make that proof matter without resources he'd never have. "Give me 10 minutes to pack." The Gulfstream had been waiting on the tarmac when they'd arrived, steps already lowered, pilot visible through the cockpit window running pre-flight checks. Maya had stopped walking when she'd seen it, hand tightening on Darius's. "Is this real?" The question had carried weight beyond its literal meaning. Was the jet real? Yes, but also was this change real? Was rescue possible? Could life shift from scarcity to something else without warning or explanation? Yes, sweetheart, this is real. The interior had been leather and polished wood, configuration more living room than transportation, seats that reclined into beds and a galley stocked with food that didn't come from dollar stores or food banks. A flight attendant had greeted them with professionalism that didn't acknowledge the contrast between their Walmart clothes and the private aviation they were boarding. Maya had chosen a seat by the window. Once they were airborne and California began falling away beneath them, Darius had watched his daughter's face as she took in clouds and landscape from a perspective she'd never experienced. Her expression had held wonder but also calculation, the internal processing of new information that would reshape her understanding of what was possible. Thomas Webb had sat across the aisle, briefcase open, documents spread across the table that folded out from the armrest. Before we land, you should understand what we've already found. He'd handed Darius a folder. Inside were bank statements showing money moving through shell corporations in patterns designed to confuse auditors, but obvious once you knew what to look for. Vanessa's name appeared nowhere, but the transaction amounts matched perfectly with the investments Darius had made. $35,000 in January 2021, $55,000 in May, $120,000 in August. Your ex-wife told you the money was for company expenses, Series C preparation, legal fees, operating capital. Those were lies. The money went into her personal accounts. She bought a house in the Hamptons for $2.4 million cash, a Porsche 911 for $90,000, jewelry, art, furniture. She spent your life savings on luxuries while telling you it was business necessity. The documentation had been thorough enough to make anger feel insufficient as response. Webb had continued, pulling out more papers. We also found $2.8 million in Cayman Islands accounts registered to a shell corporation called Cross Holdings, LLC. Brandon Cross, her chief operating officer and lover, is the beneficial owner. They've been moving money offshore for 18 months. Hiding assets from potential divorce proceedings and from the IPO auditors who would ask questions about executive compensation. Each revelation had felt like watching a building collapse in slow motion, structural failures stacking until the whole edifice of Darius's marriage revealed itself as something that had been crumbling from the foundation up. Under New York equitable distribution law, when one party conceals assets during divorce proceedings, the settlement can be voided. The concealing party typically forfeits 100% of hidden assets to the spouse. Not just what they hid, everything. Darius had absorbed this, trying to imagine Vanessa's face when she learned that her systematic fraud had legal consequences, that stealing from her husband while divorcing him wasn't just morally wrong, but actionable in ways that could cost her the empire she'd built on his work. Webb had pulled out a final document, this one technical analysis covered in highlighted sections and margin notes. Our cybersecurity team reviewed the current payflow codebase. They confirmed what you found. The offshore contractors deleted critical safety protocols. On IPO day, when transaction volume spikes, the system will crash catastrophically. 8.3 million user records exposed. The SEC will halt trading immediately. Criminal investigations will follow. Vanessa Sterling will be facing federal charges for securities fraud on top of the intellectual property theft. The jet had reached cruising altitude. Below them, the American West spread out in topography that seemed designed to illustrate scale, the vastness of space that made individual human choices feel simultaneously insignificant and absolutely determinative. Maya had been looking out the window, watching landscapes scroll past at 500 miles per hour. Darius had wanted to protect her from what was coming, from the confrontation in the courtroom and the spectacle of watching her stepmother face consequences for choices that had devastated their family. But protection meant lying, and Darius had promised himself he'd never lie to Maya the way Vanessa had lied to him. Webb had closed his briefcase, the sound of latches clicking shut punctuating the end of the briefing. Harrison wants to offer you the services of his legal team. Quinn Emanuel, the best intellectual property litigators in the country. Forensic accountants to document every dollar Vanessa stole. Technical experts to validate the security flaw. Whatever resources you need to prove what she did and make it matter in court. What does he want in return? The question had needed asking, even though Darius suspected he already knew the answer. Men like Harrison Steele didn't spend resources on strangers without reason. Even strangers who'd saved their lives. He wants to see Vanessa Sterling destroyed. Completely. Publicly. He wants her to lose everything she built on stolen foundation. He wants her arrested, charged, prosecuted. He wants her name to become a cautionary tale about what happens when you steal from people who have nothing left to lose. The honesty had been refreshing after years of Vanessa's calculated deception. And if I just want what's mine, the intellectual property, the company, the recognition that I built what she claimed to build? Webb had considered this. Then Harrison will help you get that too. But he'll be disappointed. His brother didn't just lose a lawsuit. Nathan lost his will to live because the system told him that truth didn't matter as much as money. Harrison has spent 25 years waiting for a chance to prove that wrong. You're his chance. The Bridger Mountains had appeared on the horizon then, peaks still holding snow in August, the kind of landscape that made East Coast geography feel claustrophobic by comparison. The jet had begun its descent into Bozeman, dropping through altitude toward whatever waited on the ground. The ranch had covered 5,000 acres of Montana grassland backed by mountains that made human construction seem temporary and small. The main house had been built from logs and native stone, architecture that suggested permanence rather than pretension, a place designed to last generations. Horses had grazed in pastures visible from the approach road. Fence lines had run to horizons. Harrison Steele had been waiting in a wheelchair at the base of the front steps, blanket across his lap despite the summer heat. 72 years old, military posture even seated, gray hair cut with the precision of someone who'd spent a lifetime believing that discipline in small things reflected discipline in everything else. The Medal of Honor had been displayed in a case inside the house, citation readable through glass. For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty, the helicopter rescue in Iraq, 1991. 19 soldiers extracted under enemy fire. Harrison had taken shrapnel protecting a wounded private, had refused evacuation until every other soldier was safe. The kind of heroism that couldn't be faked or bought, only earned through decisions made when fear and duty pulled in opposite directions. He'd looked at Darius with eyes that missed nothing. The electrician with steady hands. His voice had carried the roughness of age and damage, the kind of wear that came from years and injuries and the accumulated cost of having survived when others hadn't. I'm glad to see you alive. Wasn't sure I would. Darius had shaken the offered hand, grip still strong despite the wheelchair and the blanket and the visible evidence that time was winning its long war. I didn't know who I was helping that day. That's what made it matter. You ran toward the fire because someone needed help, not because helping would pay dividends. That's character, and character is what decides whether this works. A woman had appeared from inside the house, early 50s, efficient movement. The kind of person who managed complexity without making it look difficult. She'd introduced herself as Patricia Monroe, ranch manager, then gestured toward a girl standing in the doorway. This is Jade Steele, Harrison's granddaughter. Jade had been 13, dark hair pulled back, eyes that held the particular wariness of children, who'd learned young that adults couldn't always protect you from the world's cruelty. Her father had died in Iraq in 2007, IED, killed by an improvised explosive device built from stolen ordnance, the kind of circular tragedy that war generated endlessly. Maya had looked at Jade with recognition that needed no words. Two girls who'd lost parents they should have had, who'd learned to navigate grief before they'd learned algebra, who understood that family was something you lost as often as you kept. Want to see the horses? Jade's offer had been direct, unadorned with the social machinery most kids used to approach strangers. Maya had glanced at Darius for permission. He'd nodded. The girls had left together, walking toward the stables with the cautious beginning of something that might become friendship if given time. Harrison had watched them go. Jade's been alone since her mother remarried and moved to Seattle. Decided her new husband was more important than her daughter. Kids pay for adult choices, you know that better than most. They'd moved inside, Harrison's wheelchair navigating the wide hallways with practiced ease. The library had smelled like wood smoke and old paper, floor-to-ceiling windows looking out at the Bridger Range. A fire had burned despite the season, Harrison explaining that his circulation was compromised from the Iraq injuries and he ran cold even in August. Thomas showed you the documents. He showed me fraud, theft, and systematic deception spread over 6 years. That's the evidence. What matters is what you do with it. Harrison had positioned his wheelchair near the fire, gesturing for Darius to take a chair across from him. My brother Nathan was brilliant, better programmer than I ever was soldier, and I was good at soldiering. He built enterprise software in the 90s when that meant something, when code actually had to be elegant because machines couldn't brute force their way through bad architecture. His partner saw what Nathan built and decided he could sell it better without sharing credit or money. Stole the code, filed patents, raised venture capital, built a company worth $200 million. The story had the weight of something told many times but never losing its edge. Nathan sued, hired a lawyer who charged $200 an hour and was worth about half that. Went up against a legal team that cost more per day than Nathan made in a year. Lost because justice isn't blind, it's just expensive, and Nathan couldn't afford enough of it to matter. Harrison had paused, looking into the fire. Found him in a motel room in Tulsa, gunshot. He'd left a note that said he was sorry for not being strong enough to keep fighting. As if strength was the variable that mattered instead of money. The room had gone quiet except for the fire crackling and the sound of wind moving through the valley outside. I swore on his grave that if I ever found another case of intellectual property theft, I'd burn the thief down. Not for revenge, for Nathan. To prove that what happened to him wasn't inevitable, wasn't the only way these stories could end. I've been looking for 25 years. Now I've found you. Darius had absorbed this, understanding that he wasn't just a case to Harrison Steele, but a proxy war against a past that couldn't be changed, but could at least be answered. What if I don't want revenge? What if I just want what's mine? Then you're a better man than me. But you should know that Vanessa Sterling won't give you what's yours without a fight that will cost everything you don't have. She'll bury you in legal fees, destroy your reputation, make you unemployable in every industry she can reach. You've already seen what she's willing to do. The question is whether you're willing to do what's necessary to stop her. The fire had shifted, logs settling with a sound like emphasis. I can give you lawyers who win cases like yours because they're paid to win, not because they believe in justice, but because justice happens to align with victory. I can give you investigators who document fraud so thoroughly that no judge can ignore it. I can give you safety while we build the case, a place for Maya to heal instead of hiding. But I can't give you the choice, that's yours. Darius had thought about the trailer park, about Maya lying to classmates about iPads, about 67 job rejections and the systematic erasure of his contribution to technology that had made Vanessa rich. He'd thought about Nathan Steele in a Tulsa motel room, defeated by a system that measured worth in dollars, and decided his truth wasn't worth buying. I want my name on the patents I created. I want acknowledgement that I built Payflow's architecture. I want Vanessa to admit publicly that she lied about who created the technology. And I want her to face consequences for stealing $210,000 from me while telling me it was for the company. Harrison had nodded slowly. That's justice. Good. Because revenge is easy and justice is hard. But justice is what lets you sleep when it's over. He'd pressed a button on his wheelchair's armrest. Thomas Webb had appeared in the doorway, briefcase in hand. Show him the timeline. The next 10 days had been designed to transform Darius from victim to prosecutor, from someone who'd been wronged to someone who could articulate that wrong in legal language that courts would respect. The team Harrison assembled had treated the case like a military operation, which made sense given that half of them had served in special forces before transitioning to private security and corporate investigation. Isabel Navarro had arrived from Los Angeles the day after Darius landed in Montana. 45 years old, partner at Quinn Emanuel, IP litigation specialist who'd won cases against Apple and Google and companies that could afford to fight until their opponents ran out of money. She'd walked into the ranch library carrying a leather portfolio and the particular confidence that came from people who knew they were the best at what they did. "Mr. King, I've reviewed the preliminary evidence. Your case is straightforward in facts and complicated in execution. Vanessa Sterling stole your intellectual property, filed fraudulent patents, and built a company on technology she claimed to create. Proving that will require demonstrating not just that you wrote the code, but that she knew you wrote it, that she intentionally excluded you from patents, and that her actions constitute fraud rather than business disagreement." Isabel's assessment had been delivered without preamble, getting to the core issue immediately. The challenge isn't proving you built Payflow's architecture. The code speaks for itself. The challenge is proving Vanessa knew she was committing fraud rather than operating under some good faith interpretation of your partnership. We need documentation showing intent. She'd opened her portfolio, spreading documents across the library table. "Fortunately, we have that documentation. Email chains where Vanessa asks you to explain technical details so she can pitch them to investors. Text messages where she promises to add you to the cap table. Board minutes where she presents your architecture as her own innovation. Every communication is evidence of deliberate fraud." The next 3 days had been consumed by mock depositions where Isabel had played the role of Vanessa's attorney with aggressive precision, attacking Darius's credibility, questioning his memory, suggesting that his bitterness over the divorce had led him to fabricate claims about authorship that couldn't be verified. "You claim you built this algorithm, Mr. King, but you have no employment contract with Payflow. No documentation showing you were ever compensated for this work. No witnesses who can confirm your story. Isn't it true that you're simply trying to profit from your ex-wife's success because your own career failed?" The accusations had been designed to anger him, to provoke emotional responses that would make him look unstable rather than credible. Darius had failed the first 2 sessions, letting frustration override precision, answering questions with defensiveness that Isabel had immediately flagged as unacceptable. "Judges don't care about your feelings. They care about facts delivered calmly by credible witnesses. Every time you get defensive, you undermine your own case. Every time you show anger, you confirm Vanessa's narrative that you're an unstable ex-husband with an axe to grind." By the 4th session, Darius had learned to channel the anger into clarity. "I have documentation, source code with my initials in thousands of comments. Git commits showing I wrote 87% of Payflow's core functionality, email chains where Vanessa explicitly acknowledges my authorship, patent filings that use my exact technical language. The evidence speaks for itself." Isabel had nodded approval. "Better. Stick to facts. Let the documentation do the emotional work. Your job is to be credible and calm, not vindicated and angry." Garrett Mitchell had arrived on day 5. Forensic accountant from Chicago who specialized in tracing hidden assets through the shell corporations and offshore accounts that people used when they wanted money to disappear. He'd spent 2 days reviewing Vanessa's financials, building a timeline that showed where every dollar Darius had given her had actually gone. "Your ex-wife is sophisticated about hiding money, but not sophisticated enough. The $35,000 you gave her in January 2021 went into a personal account 3 days later. From there it was transferred to an LLC called Sterling Properties, which purchased the Hamptons house that same month. The pattern repeats with every transfer you made. She told you it was for company expenses. It was actually for personal asset accumulation." Garrett had created a poster-sized chart showing the money flow. color-coded to make the fraud visually obvious even to people who didn't understand financial forensics. The Cayman accounts are more interesting. Brandon Cross set up Cross Holdings LLC in 2020, shortly after he joined Payflow as COO. Since then, $2.8 million has moved through that entity, structured as consulting fees and performance bonuses that technically comply with IRS requirements but are clearly designed to hide money from potential divorce proceedings and SEC scrutiny. The evidence had been comprehensive enough to support multiple criminal charges, but Garrett had cautioned against assuming that criminal prosecution would be automatic. The U.S. Attorney's Office has limited resources and infinite cases. Unless this becomes too public to ignore, they might decide that corporate fraud is a civil matter and let you fight it out in court. Our job is to make it so public that ignoring it becomes politically impossible. Dr. Amber Cross had been the final piece of Harrison's assembled team, cybersecurity expert who'd worked for the NSA before transitioning to private consulting. She'd reviewed the Payflow codebase with the kind of systematic attention that Darius recognized from his own work, documenting every place where the offshore contractors had removed safety protocols or introduced vulnerabilities. The volume throttle deletion is catastrophic, but it's not the only problem. They also removed redundancy checks in the encryption key rotation, disabled fallback protocols for server failures, and introduced a race condition in the transaction validation that could allow duplicate charges under specific timing conditions. Any one of these would be serious. All of them together makes this system a disaster waiting to happen. She'd run simulations showing what would occur when IPO day transaction volume hit the compromised code. The crash would happen in 4 minutes and 17 seconds. Data exposure would affect 8.3 million users. Recovery would require taking the entire platform offline for a minimum of 6 hours, maybe longer if the breach triggered database corruption. Your ex-wife built an $18 billion company on a foundation that's about to collapse, and you're the only person who knows how to fix it. The strategic implication had been obvious even before Isabel had stated it explicitly. We file the injunction at exactly 9:30 a.m. on November 15th, the moment the opening bell rings at the New York Stock Exchange. We attach your technical analysis showing the security flaw, your evidence of intellectual property theft, and Garrett's forensic accounting documenting financial fraud. The SEC will have no choice but to halt trading immediately. Vanessa's IPO will collapse on live television, and every network will be covering it because tech IPOs are financial news. The plan had been elegant in its brutality. Let Vanessa have her moment of triumph. Let her stand before cameras and celebrate the success she'd stolen. Then destroy it with precision timed for maximum humiliation and minimum escape. Darius had wanted to object, to say that public humiliation was revenge rather than justice, but the distinction felt increasingly academic. Justice in this case required public acknowledgement of private fraud. The humiliation was inevitable rather than intentional. Maya had spent those 10 days at the ranch learning to ride horses with Jade, the two girls forming the kind of bond that happened when you recognize something in someone else that you'd thought was unique to yourself. Darius had watched them from the library window during breaks from legal preparation, seen his daughter laugh in ways she hadn't laughed since they'd left New York. On the 8th night, Maya had come to find him in the guest room where he'd been reviewing depositions. "Dad, can we stay here?" The question had been delivered with the directness that characterized most of Maya's requests. No preamble or negotiation, just the core desire stated plainly. "We can visit after this is over. But can we live here? Jade says there's a school in Bozeman. She says I could ride horses every day. She says Montana is better than California." Darius had set down the legal brief he'd been reading, given Maya his full attention. "Montana is beautiful, but our life is somewhere else. Our life is in a trailer. Our life is you working at Amazon and me lying about why we don't have money. This could be our life instead." The observation had been accurate enough to hurt. Harrison is helping us because he's a good man with resources he's willing to share, but this isn't our home. We can't just move into someone else's life because ours got hard. Maya had been quiet for a long moment processing this. Is it going to work? What you're doing to Vanessa? The question had required honesty, even though honesty meant acknowledging uncertainty. I don't know. We have evidence. We have good lawyers. We have a plan. But plans don't always work the way you hope. What happens if it doesn't work? Darius had thought about the trailer park, about the 67 rejections, about the life they'd return to if this failed. Then we go back to Riverside and figure out what comes next, same as we've been doing. Maya had hugged him then, fierce and sudden. I don't want you to be sad anymore. I want you to be the dad who built things instead of the dad who's too tired to build anything. The words had cut deeper than any of Isabel's mock depositions because they came from someone who loved him enough to notice what he'd been trying to hide. The final briefing had taken place on the 10th night, the full team assembled in Harrison's library. Isabel had presented the legal strategy, Garrett the financial evidence, Dr. Cross the technical analysis. Thomas Webb had outlined logistics, flights to New York, hotel accommodations, courtroom schedules, contingency plans if Vanessa's team filed counter-motions. Harrison had listened to everything without interrupting, then wheeled himself to the window overlooking the valley where horses grazed in twilight. Vanessa Sterling thinks she's won. She's been planning her victory for 12 months since the day Darius walked away from her settlement offer. She thinks silence means surrender. She spent the year preparing for her moment, the IPO that will make her a billionaire and validate every choice she made. He turned back to face the room. Tomorrow we show her that silence wasn't surrender. It was preparation. That the man she tried to erase has spent this time gathering evidence and allies and the resources to make theft expensive. That justice exists even for people who can't afford to buy it themselves. Harrison had looked directly at Darius. Your job tomorrow is to walk into that courthouse and file papers that will end Vanessa's empire. You won't be angry or vindictive or cruel. You'll be calm and factual and absolutely certain that what you're doing is right. Because it is right. She stole from you. She lied to you. She tried to make you invisible. Tomorrow we make her see exactly who you are and what you built and what it costs to underestimate people who have nothing left to lose except their integrity. The words had settled into the room like a closing argument, final summation before a verdict that wouldn't come from a jury but from the SEC and the court of public opinion and the inevitable mathematics of fraud exposed on live television. Darius had slept poorly that night, mind running through scenarios and contingencies, imagining Vanessa's face when the news broke, wondering if there was still time to call this off, to settle for something smaller and quieter that wouldn't require destroying the woman he'd once loved enough to marry. But by 3 a.m., lying in darkness while Montana stars burned through the guest room window, Darius had reached a clarity that felt less like decision than recognition of something that had been true all along. Vanessa had stolen his work and his money and his reputation. She'd made him invisible while profiting from his intelligence. She'd betrayed him and then tried to buy his silence with an offer so insulting it confirmed everything about how little she valued him. He wasn't destroying her. He was just revealing what she'd built on, letting the truth be visible instead of hidden, allowing consequences to follow choices the way they were supposed to in a universe that pretended to care about justice. Sleep had come eventually, 3 hours of uneasy rest before Thomas Webb had knocked on the door at 6 a.m. with coffee, and a reminder that the jet was fueled and ready for departure at 7. The flight back to New York had been quieter than the journey to Montana. Maya had sat with her headphones on, watching the landscape reverse beneath them. Mountains giving way to plains, giving way to the vertical density of the East Coast where space was measured in blocks instead of acres. Darius had reviewed the evidence one final time. 847 pages of documentation spread across 3 binders. Each tab marking a different element of fraud: the source code comparison, the patent filings, the financial records, the technical analysis of the security flaw, the text messages where Vanessa had called him dead weight and planned his extraction with the same wounded precision she applied to board strategy. Isabel had sat across from him making final notes on the oral arguments she'd deliver if the judge required immediate briefing. Vanessa's team will try to dismiss this as a disgruntled ex-husband seeking money he's not entitled to. They'll argue that you had 7 years to file suit about the patents and your delay implies acceptance. They'll claim the financial transfers were gifts rather than fraud, that married couples share money and you can't retroactively recharacterize generosity as theft. She'd looked up from her notes. Our response is simple. You didn't know about the fraud until you found the documentation. You believed Vanessa when she said the money was for company expenses. You trusted your wife, which is what spouses do, and she exploited that trust systematically. The delay isn't acceptance. It's evidence of how effectively she hid her fraud. The jet had descended through clouds, New York appearing beneath them in November gray. The city looked the same as when Darius had left it 12 months earlier. Indifferent to individual tragedy, perpetually generating new winners and losers in the economic machinery that defined its purpose. They'd landed at Teterboro at 6:30 p.m. The plan called for Darius to rest overnight at a hotel in Tribeca, review the filing one final time, then be at the Southern District Courthouse by 9:25 the next morning. 15 minutes before Payflow's IPO. 15 minutes before Vanessa's carefully constructed narrative collapsed under the weight of truth it had been designed to hide. Thomas Webb had arranged security, 2 former Marines who would accompany Darius to the courthouse and ensure that no one interfered with the filing. Isabel had coordinated with the clerk's office to ensure the paperwork would be accepted immediately, that there would be no bureaucratic delays that might push the filing past the critical window. Harrison's PR team had alerted select media that something significant was happening at 9:30 a.m. Enough advance notice to ensure cameras would be present, but vague enough that no one could prepare a counter-narrative. Everything was ready. Darius had checked into the hotel, ordered room service he couldn't eat, tried to sleep in a bed that felt too soft after 9 months on a trailer bunk. Maya was safe with Thomas Webb's wife in the apartment uptown, far from whatever chaos tomorrow would generate. At 2 a.m., Darius's phone had buzzed with a text from an unknown number. The message was short. I know what you're planning. We should talk, please, V. Vanessa. Somehow she'd found out. Someone had leaked, or her security team had been monitoring him, or the universe had decided that nothing could happen without giving her a chance to stop it. Darius had stared at the message for 5 minutes, thumb hovering over the delete button. Talking to Vanessa would accomplish nothing except giving her an opportunity to negotiate, to offer him something smaller than justice in exchange for his swunts, to turn tomorrow's reckoning into another transaction where she controlled the terms. He deleted the message without responding. At 7 a.m., Thomas Webb had called. She knows. Her legal team filed an emergency motion an hour ago trying to get a restraining order preventing you from interfering with the IPO. Judge denied it because you haven't interfered with anything yet, but they're spooked. They know something's coming. Does it change the plan? No. Makes it more important that we execute exactly on schedule. They'll have counters ready if we give them time to mobilize. At 9 a.m., Darius had put on the navy suit Harrison's tailor had made for him in Montana. American wool, perfect fit, the kind of clothing that communicated competence without ostentation. He'd looked at himself in the mirror and seen someone who no longer looked like the man who'd signed divorce papers in a faded MIT hoodie, who'd ridden a Greyhound to California with $347, who'd spent 9 months invisible and defeated. Thomas Webb had met him in the lobby with Isabel and the security team. Ready? Darius had thought about Nathan Steele in that Tulsa motel room, about Maya lying to classmates about iPads, about Vanessa standing in a penthouse offering him cabin and calling it fair. Yeah, let's finish this. The convoy of black SUVs had pulled away from the hotel at 9:15, 15 minutes from the courthouse. Sirens ready if traffic got heavy, every contingency planned for, every variable accounted for except the one that mattered most. Whether Darius King had the steel to follow through when the moment came to destroy the woman who'd destroyed him first. The SUVs had cut through Manhattan traffic with the efficiency that came from having sirens and drivers who understood that 15 minutes was the difference between timing and chaos. Darius had watched the city scroll past through tinted windows, each block bringing them closer to the moment when silence would stop being strategy and become testimony. At 9:27, they'd pulled up to the Southern District Courthouse. Paparazzi had already gathered on the steps, Harrison's PR team having done their work without revealing details. Cameras swung toward the convoy as Darius emerged, Isabel and Thomas flanking him, the security team creating space through the crowd. A Bloomberg reporter had thrust a microphone toward his face. "Mr. King, are you here to stop the Payflow IPO?" Darius had stopped, turned to face the cameras directly. Every lens in New York focused on him in that moment, and somewhere across town, Vanessa was standing on a balcony holding a gavel, 30 seconds from ringing a bell that would trigger her destruction. "I'm not here to stop the IPO. I'm here to report a crime." The words had landed clean and final. Darius had walked through the courthouse doors while reporters shouted follow-up questions that would be answered soon enough when the documents became public record. Isabel had filed the injunction at 9:29 and 45 seconds. 847 pages of evidence submitted to the clerk, stamped, entered into the system. Patent fraud, intellectual property theft, securities violations, critical security flaws endangering 8 million users. The case number was assigned 1:24-CV-08847. At 9:30 exactly, across town at the New York Stock Exchange, Vanessa Sterling had brought the gavel down. The opening bell had rung. Confetti had exploded from cannons. Champagne corks had popped. The ticker symbol PYFL had appeared on screens showing $52 per share. 55, 58, 62. For 90 seconds, Vanessa's moment had been perfect. Then the massive display screen had cut to CNBC breaking news. The anchor's face had appeared, professional composure barely masking shock. "We're interrupting our Payflow IPO coverage with breaking news from the Southern District of New York. An emergency injunction has just been filed against CEO Vanessa Sterling alleging systematic fraud, intellectual property theft, and critical security vulnerabilities that endanger millions of users." The camera had cut to courthouse steps. Footage of Darius walking in, his declaration playing on loop. "I'm here to report a crime." At the NYSE, Vanessa's champagne glass had slipped from her hand. The sound of crystal shattering on marble had been lost beneath the sudden chaos of 200 people checking phones simultaneously. Board members and investors and journalists all trying to understand what had just happened. A floor official's voice had boomed over the loudspeakers. "Trading halted. Code red. Trading halted on PYFL pending regulatory review." The number on the screen had frozen at $62 per share. The graph that had been climbing had gone flatline. Dead. Brandon Cross had backed toward the exit. Vanessa had reached for him, but he'd kept moving, already calculating his own survival. The rats and sinking ships instinct that defined men like him. 3 hours later, the Quinn Emanuel conference room had become a kill floor designed to look like negotiation. Vanessa had arrived with a public defender, her assets frozen by SEC order, the expensive lawyers having quit the moment their retainers bounced. She'd looked smaller than Darius remembered, hollowed out by 3 hours of watching her empire collapse on television, of fielding calls from investors threatening lawsuits, of FBI agents explaining that securities fraud carried federal prison time. Isabel had laid out the evidence with surgical precision. Exhibit A, source code comparison showing Mr. King authored 87% of Payflow's core architecture. His initials in thousands of comments, his design patterns throughout. Your patent filings claim sole inventorship. That's fraud. Vanessa's lawyer had tried to object, but Isabel had continued. Exhibit B, financial records showing $205,000 Mr. King transferred to you for alleged company expenses. The money went to personal accounts. You bought a Hamptons house, a Porsche, jewelry. That's theft. Garrett Mitchell had stepped forward with the poster-sized chart showing money flow in color-coded streams. Exhibit C, $2.8 million in Cayman Islands accounts registered to Brandon Cross's shell company. Hidden from divorce proceedings and IPO auditors, that's money laundering and securities fraud. Dr. Amber Cross had been last, her technical analysis displaying on the screen behind her. Exhibit D, critical security flaw in current payflow code. When trading opened today, your system would have crashed in 4 minutes and 17 seconds. 8.3 million user records would have been exposed. The SEC has confirmed this assessment. You built an $18 billion company on a ticking bomb, and only Mr. King knows how to defuse it. The room had gone silent except for the sound of Vanessa breathing too fast, hyperventilating toward panic. Isabel had closed the evidence binders. You have two options. Fight this and face federal prosecution for fraud, theft, and securities violations. Or settle. Transfer all intellectual property rights to Mr. King. Admit publicly that you lied about creating the technology. Cooperate with SEC investigators. Darius had spoken for the first time since entering the room. I'm taking control of Payflow, restructuring it as Architect Systems. The investors have agreed because I'm the only person who can fix the code and salvage the IPO. You'll transfer everything. In exchange, I drop the civil suit. I won't push for criminal charges. He'd paused, let the offer sit there incomplete. And because I believe in fairness, I'll give you the Montana cabin. And $150,000 a year for 3 years. The words had been Vanessa's exact offer from 12 months earlier, mirrored back to her with precision that made the cruelty obvious. She'd offered him scraps when she'd held power. Now he was offering her the same scraps from a position of absolute dominance, showing her exactly what she'd been. Vanessa had started crying, not the calculated tears she'd used to manipulate investors, but the ugly kind that came from genuine devastation. I'll sign. 6 months had passed in a sequence of consequences that felt inevitable only in retrospect. Vanessa had been fired by Payflow's board within hours of the settlement. She'd moved out of the penthouse into a studio apartment in Queens, taken a paralegal job at $45,000 a year, learned what it meant to measure worth in hourly wages instead of stock options. Brandon Cross had been arrested, leaving the NYSE, FBI waiting with handcuffs and a warrant. He'd taken a plea deal, 18 months minimum security in exchange for testimony about the offshore accounts. His lawyer had gotten him assigned to a facility that taught computer skills to inmates, which felt like justice of the ironic variety. Darius had spent 3 months fixing Payflow's code, working 18-hour days to rebuild what the offshore contractors had broken, to restore the safety protocols he'd designed 8 years earlier. The work had been exhausting and clarifying in equal measure, reconnecting him with the part of himself that Vanessa had tried to erase. In May 2025, Architect Systems had gone public. Darius had let Maya ring the opening bell, his daughter standing before cameras in a dress she'd chosen herself, grinning at the moment that proved her father had been right to fight. The stock had opened at $58, closed at $94. Darius's stake was worth $240 million. He hadn't smiled during the celebration, just watched Maya and understood that winning meant his daughter would never have to lie about iPads again, would never have to navigate poverty while pretending it was planning, would never have to protect her father's dignity at the cost of her own. The money had changed logistics without changing purpose. They'd moved from the trailer to a loft in Tribeca, Maya to a private school where intelligence was celebrated rather than penalized, but Darius had kept teaching the free coding boot camp on Saturday mornings. Kept working with kids who reminded him of the person he'd been at the public library in Detroit, teaching himself Python because opportunity wasn't given, but could be built. One afternoon in November, a year after the courthouse filing, Darius had been grocery shopping when he'd seen Vanessa in the produce section. She'd looked older, harder, the particular aging that came from having been broken by choices you couldn't unmake. Their eyes had met across a display of apples. Neither had spoken. What was there to say that hadn't already been said in courtrooms and settlements and the public record of fraud exposed? They'd both kept walking, two people who'd once promised to prove her father wrong together, who'd built something real before ambition had poisoned it, who now existed as cautionary tales about different kinds of failure. Darius had felt nothing. No anger, no satisfaction, no curiosity about whether she'd learned anything from the destruction. Just the empty recognition that some connections, once broken, stayed broken regardless of time or distance, or the particular mathematics of who won and who lost. That evening, an email had arrived. The sender was listed as Vanessa Sterling. The subject line, "I'm sorry." Darius had hovered over the delete button for a long time before opening it. The message was short. "I started a nonprofit, Tech Ethics Foundation, teaching about intellectual property rights and the damage theft causes. I know it doesn't fix what I did, but I'm trying to make sure it doesn't happen to someone else. I'm sorry for everything. You deserved better. Maya deserved better. I hope she's okay. V." Attached was a link to a website. Darius had clicked through. The foundation was small, earnest, teaching coding ethics to students who wouldn't learn it elsewhere. Vanessa's photo was on the About page, looking humbled in ways that seemed genuine rather than performed. Maya had appeared in the doorway of his office. "What are you looking at?" "Email from Vanessa. She started a nonprofit teaching coding ethics." Maya had come to look at the screen, reading over his shoulder with the speed that came from being 11 going on 30. "Are you going to help her?" The question had assumed generosity Darius wasn't sure he possessed. "I don't know. What do you think?" Maya had been quiet, processing with the seriousness she brought to everything. "I think people who do bad things can still do good things after. I think she hurt us, but maybe she can help other people not get hurt. I think you should do whatever makes you not sad anymore." The wisdom had come from someone who'd learned too young that adults were fallible, that mothers could leave, that stepmothers could betray, that fathers could be defeated and still find ways to fight back. Darius had closed the laptop without responding to the email. "Want to get ice cream?" They'd walked to the shop 3 blocks away, same chain where they'd stopped on the drive back from the Napa retreat 4 years earlier, when Maya had been 9 and asking if her parents were getting divorced. She'd been right then, and she'd learned to be right about most things since. The particular prescience that came from watching adults closely enough to see through the lies they told themselves. At the counter, Maya had ordered the same thing she always did, chocolate with too many toppings. Darius had watched his daughter attack the ice cream with focus that suggested this was the most important thing happening in the world, which in that moment it was. "Dad?" "Yeah. I'm glad we fought back. Even when it was hard, even when we were poor. I'm glad you showed me that standing up for what's right matters more than being comfortable." The observation had hit like vindication and accusation simultaneously. Confirmation that the choice had been right, but also acknowledgement of the cost Maya had paid for her father's principles. "I'm glad too, sweetheart, even though I wish you hadn't had to go through any of it." Maya had shrugged, the gesture suggesting she'd made peace with things Darius was still processing. "I learned stuff about who people really are, about what matters. That's worth something." They'd finished their ice cream and walked home through November evening that felt different from the November evening 12 months earlier when Darius had been standing in a courthouse watching Vanessa's empire collapse. Same city, same season, completely different universe of possibility. At home, Darius had opened his laptop one more time, looked at Vanessa's email, thought about Nathan Steele who'd killed himself because the system had told him his truth didn't matter. Thought about Harrison who died 3 months earlier, peaceful in his sleep, having lived long enough to see justice delivered if not mercy extended. He'd typed a response. "The foundation is good work. I won't be involved, but I hope it helps people. What you did to me was wrong. What you're doing now doesn't erase that, but maybe it means something anyway. Take care of yourself. D." He'd hit send before he could reconsider, then closed the laptop and went to check on Maya, who was doing homework at the kitchen table, math problems about variables and equations and the kind of logic that suggested outcomes were deterministic if you understood the relationships between inputs. Need help? Nah, I got it. Of course she did. Maya had always gotten it, had always understood more than she should have needed to, had always been the person in their family who saw clearly when everyone else was still fumbling in darkness. Darius had stood there watching his daughter work, thinking about the journey from a Boston coffee shop to a Manhattan loft, from partnership to betrayal to something that wasn't quite redemption but might eventually become peace. You couldn't undo the past, couldn't make Vanessa's theft unhappen or Nathan's suicide unrealized, or the 9 months in the trailer park anything other than what they'd been. But you could decide what came next. You could choose whether bitterness would define you or just inform you. You could measure success not in what you'd lost, but in what you'd built after people tried to convince you that building was impossible. The phone rang. Unknown number. Darius almost didn't answer, but something made him pick up. Mr. King, this is Sarah Chen from MIT. We received your application to our graduate program in computer science. I'm calling to tell you you've been accepted with a full scholarship. We were particularly impressed by your work on distributed transaction systems. We'd love to have you join us next fall. The offer hung in the air, unexpected and perfect. The universe occasionally delivering justice through channels you hadn't thought to request. I'll need to think about it. I have a daughter. We have excellent family housing, and our lab could use someone with your expertise. Think about it. The offer stands. After she hung up, Darius sat with the information, processing what it would mean to go back to school at 39, to pursue the credentials he'd never thought mattered until they'd become weapons Vanessa used against him. Maya looked up from her homework. MIT? How did you... I could hear. You going to do it? Would you be okay if I did? Maya had smiled, the real smile, the one that reminded Darius why every fight had been worth fighting. Yeah, Dad, I'd be okay. I think you should go build something new. I think that's what you're good at. Building things, not being sad about things that got broken. Wisdom from an 11-year-old who'd earned the right to dispense it. That night, Darius had stood at the window of their loft looking out at Manhattan, the city that had witnessed his erasure and his vindication, that had been indifferent to both because cities were just spaces where human drama played out against the backdrop of commerce and ambition. Somewhere out there, Vanessa was probably lying awake too, staring at her own ceiling, processing her own consequences, living inside the story she'd written where she was the villain instead of the hero. But that was her burden to carry. Darius had carried enough for both of them. He'd built something from nothing once. He'd build it again. Not for revenge or vindication or proof, but because building was what he did. Because showing Maya that you could be destroyed and still reconstruct yourself mattered more than any amount of money or recognition or the particular satisfaction that came from watching enemies fall. Tomorrow he'd email MIT, accept the offer, start planning the move, begin the next chapter that didn't require Vanessa's destruction to validate his worth. Tonight he'd sleep well for the first time in years. Because silence had never been surrender. It had always been preparation for the moment when speaking would matter most, and now that moment had passed, and what came next was simply living, which turned out to be harder and better than winning had ever been.